Okay, now let me just get this shared. Give me a minute. Wish they made it easier to share.
I feel like it's it
Like I wish you
for
could just check to share it into different places instead of having to do it one by one.
it seems like it should be much easier.
All right. Okay, if anyone's here already, go ahead and drop a comment. Let us know where you're watching from. Say hello in the comments and let us know you're here and where you're watching from. Okay, I think I've officially got us going here on Facebook. All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to our monthly TBI talk here with Dr. Perry Maynard from Integrated Brain Centers in Denver, Colorado. We are chatting today all about memory. I see I had to write it down so I wouldn't forget. We're talking all about memory issues after brain injury and concussion. Whether that's short-term or long-term memory problems. I hear the gamut of people's struggles. Myself personally, I had the first few months, I had extreme short-term memory problems. I couldn't retain anything. And even now, 7 years out, I struggle learning new things. I still remember everything I've learned before my brain injury, but learning new things, it takes a lot more work for me to get it to stick and get it into that long-term memory. So excited to have you here and hear what you have to share. I think maybe we can talk a little bit about like what causes the memory problems after a brain injury, and then maybe some coping strategies on how to help strengthen that.
Definitely. So, I mean, when we look at cause, right, it can be, a variety of things. I think the big thing, we can first start to talk about is the different types of memory, how we encode, how we store, how we retrieve memory, because these all come from different regions. So that if one is suffering from a certain type of memory loss, you can say, okay, there's clearly damage to that area. Now, the damage, once again, could purely be from that shearing force of damage of axons. It could be something upstream. It could be the inflammatory process from a head injury. It could be the effect that it has on the neuroendocrine system, right? So there could be numerous different reasons. I think the important piece where we can start is kind of discussing just memory in general. Because like you said before, you don't necessarily have issues with maybe memories from your past, but learning new memories, right? So what does that really mean? So if we look at memory, right, we can first break it into short and long-term memory, right? So if we're looking at short-term memory, really anything greater than a minute, right, we're looking at more working memory. So attention, how do we zone out irrelevant information while trying to stay on task, and some of these individuals might be someone where you're having a conversation, in the middle of the conversation it's kind of like, wait, where were we going, or what were we talking about,
what were we
in
talking
regards to
about?
that,
Yep.
right? And that's that frontal lobe. So your frontal lobe plays a huge role in working memory, right? And we'll come back into just a second on how important working memory is in creating new memories. New memories that then turn into longer memories. We then have long-term memory, and then we can split long-term memory into declarative memory and non-declarative memory. And under declarative memory, we can have kind of semantic memory, which is just random general facts, right? So who won the Super Bowl in 2004, 2003, right? And then we can have more episodic memory, which has to do more with maybe more important events like a daughter's wedding or your wedding or the birth of a child, right? All these kind of lifelong things, right? And these things are more in the medial temporal lobe, right? Or in the temporal lobe. And within that temporal lobe, we have a medial aspect, which is more in the midline. and then a lateral aspect, right? And this is where that hippocampus comes into play. So that's more declarative or long-term memory. And then we have more non-declarative memory. And within that, that has more to do with understanding or remembering how to do reflexive things. So things like walking, things like talking, brushing your teeth, riding a bike, driving a car, right? And these are more procedural type memory things, right? And this is important because someone may discuss that their spouse is forgetting how to tie their shoes, right? That comes from different regions. That's more associated with procedural memory, which is a little bit more basal ganglion cerebellum, right? So we start to see that all of these are created in different areas. So now that we know that, we can talk about how do we produce new memory. So maybe it's our wedding day, right? So our frontal lobe has to be there in order to start producing this kind of short-term memory of the event, this working memory. And then our limbic system, right, our emotional circuit has to determine what's relevant and what's irrelevant. So it's kind of like people talk about, if you really want to remember something, put a limbic context towards it. Or maybe if you're a young kid and you do something, silly in class, or you get called on in front of the whole class and you're not paying attention, right? There's a huge limbic component to that. And you'll probably never forget that, versus you may forget other things that didn't come with as much of an emotional connection, right? So you should remember your wedding. It should be a very emotionally triggering positive event. So that frontal lobe first has to be functional, and then we have to have limbic activity, and then we have to start to encode that memory, right? And that encoding or that storing then occurs via the hippocampus or the temporal lobe. So now the temporal lobe starts to encode that memory. So now that a year or two later, I can say, hey, I remember, my wedding. It was great. We did this, we did that. But there also has to be retrieval of that memory. So I first have to have a frontal lobe. I then have to have an emotional connection. I then have to store it in my hippocampus, and then I have to retrieve it. So then I have to go back into those areas, bring it back to my frontal lobe and all these other areas to then be able to recall it. So you can see there's this whole process. And sometimes
Right.
the way an individual describes their memory, we may say, oh, it's an encoding issue, or it's a retrieval issue, or it's an issue in that hippocampus, right? And so these can start giving you a window into areas that may be affected. So let's say maybe an individual has no problem with forgetting general facts, their wedding, semantic memory is good, right? These random, maybe sports facts, or who's the president, or what year is it? And right, there's no issues in procedural memory, but they're having a lot of issues in focusing or attending to things. Maybe it's more of a frontal lobe issue, or all those past memories are good. It's more of an issue now in creating new memories. So now what's going on with that frontal lobe and that ability to encode new memories, versus maybe someone where those things are okay or they're not great, but an individual starting to forget general facts, or once again, important life things. Now you may be starting to think about what's going on in that hippocampus. So these things are really important in not only brain injuries, but also cognitive decline, things like Alzheimer's
Yeah.
and other neurocognitive disorders, because they can give you an idea of stages or where is an individual at, right? So that's kind of the big thing to pay attention to. And so you can pick that up via history, but there's also different cognitive testing we can start to pick up, okay, where along this memory spectrum seems to be affected. Okay, here's the area that seems to be most likely affected, because this will answer your question of what are things that we can do maybe therapeutically, because they might be different to what we do to the hippocampus versus, let's say, maybe the frontal lobe versus the cerebellum or the basal ganglia per se. So that's kind of a brief synopsis of what is memory, what are the types of memory, and how does the whole kind of neurophysiological process work.
Right. And if there's like a hiccup in any part of that loop, it can throw the whole thing off. Um,
Mhm.
I want to take a minute to talk about in the beginning of your explanation, you talked about attention. And I know for me, I had a lot of attention problems. Like I could not focus. Like if someone was talking to me and they were like on their third sentence, I was still trying to process the first sentence. And then I think eventually I just gave up and zoned out and didn't even hear what they were talking about. And I hear this repeatedly from TBI people, and they're often told they have TBI induced ADD, which isn't actually really a thing. And they want to put them, they wanted to put me on Ritalin. What I've come to learn is that's actually part of the memory system that's been impacted, and processing and memory, right? And so like my processor was slow, right?
Yeah.
I had to close down some tabs in order to get that the processing speed to increase. So maybe talk a little bit about that for people who have been told that that's what their problem is, and perhaps medications aren't helping with that.
Yeah, I mean, that temporal lobe we talked about with memory also has a ton to do with auditory processing. So you could have individuals also who have maybe issues in more visual processing, or maybe more auditory processing, right? And those are all different areas of the brain, auditory wise, right? Could there be something wrong with the ear itself that's affecting one's ability to hear? Maybe. Or something along the entire auditory pathway. Or there's an area of our brain called Wernicke's area. And when this is extremely affected, people can have what's called Wernicke's aphasia, where they don't understand and can't process speech, right? So that's the extreme. So these individuals, you may say, point to the ceiling and they just smile and look at you, right? And they're having trouble processing auditory information. But a head injury could still affect that area to where maybe it's not that extreme, but literally the information coming in, your brain's having trouble processing, right? Or going back to that frontal lobe, but I think you said it perfectly in general, that there's so many different circuits that need to work together. So that's where, taking a symptom and medicating, it's difficult because that symptom could be for so many different reasons, right?
Right.
Like we chatted about yesterday in our other discussion, is that also maybe there's an energy component, that there's such a fatigue ability in the brain that they can only handle so much. Or like we talked about, there's an auditory issue that needs to be affected, or maybe it's a frontal lobe issue, and the way you go about those may be totally different versus just giving someone Adderall and in essence putting their frontal lobe on speed, which I mean may work, right? Because you're literally just lighting up the executive part of the brain to try to compensate for all of this other destruction elsewhere. But what we really want to try to do is isolate the area that seems to be affected and try to improve that to the best of the ability, so that we're not having to get other areas to compensate for the area that's not working well.
And I think that's where there's such a big breakdown in traditional medicine. I think the average person goes first to their primary care physician after a concussion, and then perhaps then they get referred to a neurologist, because it seems like the logical place to go, neurology, brain. But what I see happening over and over again is like they don't fully understand the complexity of all the systems in the same way that functional neurology does, right? And it just blows my mind how you can take 20 minutes with someone, ask them a few questions, and figure out like, oh, it's that part of their brain that's not firing. And so anyone who hasn't watched last month's talk, we talked about the difference between traditional neurology and functional neurology. You can find that in the YouTube playlist if you didn't catch that one. But, I think that's because for me, I went from doctor to doctor to doctor for 18 months. I think it was like a year and a half before I found functional neurology. And I was just blown away by the things, like I said, the whole ADD, and they wanted to put me on Ritalin, and how when it was explained to me by a functional neurologist, it all made so much sense. Like, oh, that's why this has been happening. And like you've already explained, like memory is a complicated system. It's not just simply you take a memory and put it in this box. It like has to go through an entire loop before it gets put into that box. And so if there's a breakdown anywhere in that loop, you're going to have problems with
Yeah.
different types of memory, like you said, either short-term, long-term processing, attention. So yeah, so what are some things people watching could potentially do to try to either figure out maybe what part of their memory is the problem, or to help it?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. I think, one of the big things is trying to get to someone that can really tease those things out, because going back to that point is, I'll just use this as an example, is we know that, right, with head injuries heavily can affect, right, the inner ear, right? We've talked about that a ton.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting is that when we look at the hippocampus, right, which we've talked about heavily, that has to do with all these aspects of memory, is that the hippocampus actually gets a ton of inputs from the inner ear, right? Because it has a ton to do with spatial memory, right? So your hippocampus has to do with where'd you put your keys, where'd you park your car, where are you in the world, right? So it's really cool because it gives you these things called grid cells and place cells, right? So grid cells grid out your environment. Place cells let you know where you are in the world. And what they've shown in some research is that when they destroy the inner ear, you lose those in the hippocampus, right? And so you can induce memory issues. So we have to look at and understand that there can be issues in the hippocampus itself or something downstream, right? So an individual could have balance issues or dizziness issues and all of a sudden develop memory issues. And if you fix the one before, those all of a sudden might come back and get better, So that's kind of one example of one influence. And then the other piece is that we know that hormones, so things like progesterone and estrogen, have large receptors in the hippocampus and the frontal lobe, and play a role in serotonin function, dopamine function, acetylcholine, which is a massive kind of memory neurotransmitter. We also know that cortisol, right? So we know that the stress hormone and circadian rhythms or sleep-wake cycles also play a role in that hippocampus. So we know that the hippocampus, the memory area, creates circadian rhythms and helps produce cortisol. But we also know that excessive cortisol or dysregulated cortisol can chew up that hippocampus. So this is, I bring this up in that it's really, really important to get to an appropriate provider, so you can really figure out what are the appropriate steps. I think from an overall standpoint, it's hard to, there's so many different, right, brain games out there and memory exercises, right? And I think for most people, those won't hurt. It's hard to say if those are really going to be a fix-all for everyone, because how do you know which one to play, or what are the other things that are just affecting? It's kind of like, okay, what are exercises to affect my, my bicep? Well, you get all the best exercises, but if you're not sleeping and let's say you haven't been eating for 2 weeks, how effective are those really going to be? So there's a ton of different tools that we can use, everything from diet to different supplements. From a supplement standpoint, there's, from an overall simplistic standpoint, there are some cool different supplements that have a lot of research in the realm of Alzheimer's, right? And that's where, we're looking at things like essential fatty acids. So things like omega-3s, there's different things like coffee fruit extract, which is in, sometimes you'll find in a lot of different supplements, which improves what's called BDNF, something called alpha GPC, which gives you choline precursors to help with acetylcholine. These are some kind of, simple supplements that have been studied against some of these neurocognitive disorders and actually have high levels of evidence. So there are some supplements that are can be good for a lot of people, but I don't want to say are necessary fixes for all people with memory
Right.
issues, because there's just so many different reasons why they really could be occurring. And that's why it's really important to find someone who is more like a functional neurologist, who's willing to look at those things and then create an appropriate strategy to then help with that cause of the memory loss.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, no two brain injuries are the same, no two recoveries are the same, no two treatment plans are the same. And again, I think that's where the traditional system fails us too, is they just have cookie cutter programs that they want to put everybody through. And some people will succeed in them and then others won't have any results because everybody has individual needs. So anyone watching on the live feed, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. I'm going to update it here, see if there's anything. So drop a comment below if you have any questions for Dr. Maynard about memory issues, or if you have any other burning questions that he can perhaps answer for you. Next month, our topic is going to be about numbness, tingling, and neuropathy. So if you have any of those issues lingering, be sure to watch next month's TBI talk. And as I said earlier, you can always catch all of our past TBI talks on the YouTube channel. And just clicking on the playlist for TBI talk. So if you have missed any of our past ones, be sure to check those out as well. We've covered a lot of really great topics. So I'm not seeing, I'm going to refresh again to see if there's any questions coming in. Anything else, Perry? Any other words of wisdom you have in regards to memory today?
I think for those who are not having memory issues, or maybe are starting to have some subjective memory issues, right? We always joke about brain farts or things like that, and
yeah,
we all have these, and there's no reason to necessarily panic. But it's important to say, what maybe can I change? And I want to guide everyone in that. I think one individual's work who I think has done a really great job summarizing and giving really good steps is Dale Bredesen. So once again, he is more from a standpoint of Alzheimer's, but I'll give it to him. He's done a great job writing a handful of books that really summarizes a ton of information and things that we understand in regards to memory loss and cognitive decline, and all the factors that we understand, how to get tested, how to look at some of these metrics. I mean, we do this testing with patients all the time, but is to, like I said, not panic, but start to say, okay, how can I optimize things, right? How can I get on top of these things before they become an issue, right? Because, when things become subjectively interfering, right, you can make big changes. When all of a sudden your neurocognitive test starts coming back questionable, it's much more difficult, so I'd say,
right,
act sooner rather than later. It's never too early to take steps. If you're in your 30s, it's not going to hurt to start taking steps 30s, 40s, 50s. Don't wait until it's severely impacting your life. Make the steps now and understand where are your weak points. So going back to Dale Bredesen, he does a really good job putting things into different categories. And maybe you start to realize, like, my brain issues are more related to hormones, or maybe inflammation, or blood sugar, right? To keep it simple. So then your weak points. So then the areas that you really need to pay attention to and work on. So it's get that assessment done, and then figure out what are the little areas you need to check in on, or how do you love your brain more? As Kevin Pierce trademarked so well in loving your brain and taking care of your brain. So that would be my biggest piece of advice: is it's never too early to start. And those little things that you're noticing even at a young age, take seriously and start taking steps to try to put your brain in a better spot.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Maynard, for being here this month and talking all about memory. I look forward to having you here again next month.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy.